So you've read a little bit about why we take notes and how we can take notes, but I want to go in a little bit more depth now with you with this brief guide to note taking. I'm Dr. Stephanie Jury, and I'm the Learning Strategist at the Student Learning Hub. This presentation is going to cover a few different things. First, I'm going to talk about why taking notes is so important and some of the challenges that we face when trying to take notes in class. I'm going to give you some ways in which to overcome those challenges. And then I'll be sharing 5 different note-taking styles you might consider trying out this term, depending on what you are studying. We're going to wrap up with some ways to get the most out of your notes that you take. As you follow along this video, I encourage you to take notes using the Cornell note-taking method style, which is part of the activity that you're working on right now. I'm going to talk more about the Cornell note-taking method as we go. It is one of the 5 note-taking styles that we'll be discussing. At the beginning of this section of the module on note-taking, I mentioned that there were 2 kinds of students in high school. The students that took a lot of notes and tried to write down everything that their teachers said, and then the students that took little or few notes throughout their classes. And if you're one of those students that fall into the second category, so few notes or no notes at all, you might be wondering, why should I start taking notes now at university? Well, professors will share extra information in class that is not on the slides and will not be provided to you in another format. And it's important for you to record this because some of that information might end up on your midterm or your final exam. So when you take notes of this extra information, it acts as a file of information for you that you can draw upon later. Taking notes also helps you move from just passively listening to the lecture and moving into a more active form of learning. When we take notes, it requires us to process the information and paraphrase it into our own words. Or at least that's the most ideal way to take notes. It's to condense what we learn, put it into our own words, and write it out in a way that makes sense to us. You can write notes out word for word as your professor speaks them, but professors speak very quickly, and you're going to find that a challenge. I'm going to talk about challenges in a second. But what I want you to remember, the takeaway from this, is that when you take some notes, it's going to help you remember about 60% of the content from that lecture. And if you then walk away from the lecture and you organize those notes and you review those notes, you'll remember around 90% of the material. So after about 2 days of taking notes, we forget about 69% of material. And that's if we don't review the notes or we don't use the notes in some way. Whereas if we continually review those notes afterwards, like I said, we're going to remember about 90% of that information indefinitely. This is why taking notes is so important. I mentioned that one of the challenges when taking notes is that it's hard to write out what a professor is saying verbatim or word for word. And that's because professors talk fairly quickly. They have a lot of content to get through each week. And our writing and our typing speeds are usually slower than a spoken speed. And so if you're trying to write things out exactly as they are spoken, you'll find that you fall behind quickly. So that's why I say it's important to try and condense and paraphrase your notes as much as possible. Having said that, I realize that professors can be hard to understand, and it can be hard to condense and to paraphrase when you have so much new information being given to you. You know, sometimes professors are using language and specialized terms that we're unfamiliar with, and sometimes lectures are hard to follow because they're nonlinear or they're delivered in a way we're not used to. And a lot of note taking is honestly learning about your professor and learning about their style and how they like to deliver their lecture, becoming confident with the way in which they deliver that lecture. The other thing is determining how to tell when your professor is trying to indicate to you that the information they're giving you is the most important information and is what you should actually be writing down. So, how can we start to overcome some of these challenges? I think one of the most important steps that we can take here is to do our readings. And there's different ways in which you can approach your readings. Some people like to read prior to going to class, some like to read after class, but I think there is a real argument here to doing your readings prior to class and to having a bit of an understanding of what is going on or what you can expect to go on in class. This is going to help manage those unfamiliar terms and manage perhaps a class that maybe doesn't have a linear flow to it. So I encourage you to pre-read. Pre-read is sort of skimming the materials that you've been given, or to do a complete pre-class reading of all of your materials, whether that includes videos or if it's just simply readings. It's going through everything that you have been given ahead of time in class to be as prepared as possible before you walk in. The other important thing is to make sure you understand your syllabus and to specifically look for the learning outcomes that are included in your syllabus. These learning outcomes will tell you what to expect in regards to what you're going to learn. Sometimes you're given those weekly, sometimes you're given them for the entire term, but just being aware of what those are can help guide you when you walk into class. The other thing to think about is where you physically are in the room. So you walk into class and you might be tempted to sit at the back of the room because you're a little worried about being right up front and center stage with the professor. But honestly, sitting front and center is the best place for you. You're going to be able to hear the professor best. If you have questions, you can raise your hand. You're right there. They're going to see you. And it's the best place to sit if you want to avoid distractions, okay? Because people aren't going to be talking at the front of the classroom. They're going to be sitting there diligently taking their notes or diligently listening. Another thing that I would recommend is to make sure that you have the correct materials with you when you walk into class. And that can be note-taking templates, which we're going to talk about in a second, a recording device if you are allowed one. Okay, so if you're a student registered with the DRC, this might be an accommodation that you have. It might also be something that you can simply discuss with using with your professor. And writing tools. So how do you want to take your notes? Have that decision made before you walk into class. Have a think about what is going to be the easiest and best way for you to take notes for each class that you do. One class that you do, it might be best for you to handwrite all of your notes or take your notes on a tablet. In another class, you might choose to type them all. So think about what method is going to best suit the course that you are in. And then finally, you have to have the right attitude when you walk into class. You have to have an open and a ready mind. If the class before didn't go well, don't walk into the next class thinking it also will not go well. Okay? Each class is a learning experience for you and an opportunity for you to reflect on what went well and what we can do to change. This is a growth mindset. It's a very important mindset for us to have in university. Don't be afraid to ask questions to yourself or of yourself or to your professor. This is why sitting in the front is great. You're right there. Professor's going to see you, like I said, when you put your hand up, easy access to them. And finally, be open to adapting to the teaching style. Everyone teaches differently. Not all of your professors are going to be the same. You need to be flexible. And if something is not making sense or something is not working for you, don't be afraid to ask a professor to repeat themselves or to explain it in a different way. So, what should we be considering when we're in class? The first thing I want you to do is think carefully about what you record. And I know I have mentioned this a few times already, but when you are writing notes, you want to make sure that you are paraphrasing and condensing what is said. Don't try to write out everything word for word. The other thing I don't want you to try to do is to repeat what's already on the slides, particularly if you are given the slides. Whether you're given them in advance or after the class, it doesn't really matter. But what matters is to focus your attention really on listening and absorbing and understanding, and just writing out those bits and pieces of information which further explain the content of what you've already been provided with. And I also encourage this, if you've done your readings ahead of time, is to consider, the notes you've taken ahead of a time from your readings, and then what from the lectures is going to add onto or enhance those notes from your readings. The other thing is I want you to find your own writing style. And by this, I mean, think about ways that you can further condense notes or you can write more quickly. You might consider abbreviations or making your own shorthand using symbols. Just make sure that you know what each symbol means. And just think about whatever works for you. So some people like to draw diagrams or include pictures. If you're taking your notes digitally, if you're taking them in something like OneNote, you might copy and paste pictures from the internet that you find or snapshots of the slides into your notes. You might take a picture of the slides on your phone and then import that into OneNote. So just think about what is going to help you remember the content best or condense that content best. And then finally, in terms of thinking about what is the most important, there's a few cues that we can look for. First, we want to listen for verbal cues, so changes in topic. If a professor says but, however, next, on the other hand, therefore, this indicates that there's something important about to be said. There's an exception that's about to be pointed out. This is something you're going to want to note down. You're also going to want to look for grouping of information. If a professor is grouping information a particular way, again, something probably important is going on here. The other thing is to listen for qualifying words. So that includes sometimes, rarely, and usually. Again, an exception, something important to note. Professors also tell us when something is important based on their body language. So if they start to gesture excitedly or they're pointing at something a lot, even if they're just repeating something again and again, so verbal again, all of that indicates importance and you probably should write it down. If you're not sure though, like I said before, ask questions and clarify. The professor is there to answer those questions for you and to help you on this learning journey. I guarantee you, you're not the only person with a question or that question that you have in mind in that class, so don't be afraid to ask it. So now that we have an idea of what signals importance in class and therefore what we should take notes of, let's talk very quickly about a few different note-taking styles that we can try. The style that you're trying out right now is called the Cornell note-taking method. It's one of the better known ones. It's simple and effective and takes very little preparation in terms of setup. It's just got those three sort of boxes, if you will. A left-hand side for cues or important information like definitions, for example, or questions. A bigger section where we take notes, and that can be in bullet points, it can be full sentences, it can include diagrams. And then we have that bottom portion, which is for a summary or review. So basically, the Cornell method allows us to take, organize, and review our notes in a shorter amount of time. It's a good style to have used when it comes time to prepare for exams. It makes it a lot easier. It allows you to learn better. That summary bit is so important because not only are you condensing and reviewing your notes as you're going in class, right? You're paraphrasing as we go in class, but then after class, you're sitting down and you're doing a summary again. So you're further condensing and paraphrasing. So it's a great sort of spaced learning method, but it's not the only note taking style out there. The outline method is quite a linear style of note taking, and it's well suited for online learning, particularly asynchronous courses that are quite methodical and self paced. So, if you're able to start and stop your videos, for example, this is a good note taking style for that. It's not necessarily the best style for STEM, like physics or math classes, might not be the best style for you because you do need to be able to identify a clear sort of informational structure. Um, this is why you might not want to use it in a fast paced lecture. But this is a good style if you're looking to build coherence and connections as you paraphrase. Another style you might try is charting. Now, charting is good for taking notes in classes which contain a lot of facts or statistical information, as well as a lot of subtopics which are directly comparable to others. It's very visual because it's a table, and it's best suited for those who like to take minimal notes. So we're talking just a few words, maybe a sentence every here or there. It's also a really good way to condense your notes and review them for exams. It's a style that is well suited for STEM-based courses. Mapping is another style you might consider, but mapping is challenging, and so I would sort of caution against it if you're not really familiar with mind mapping, say, to begin with. But basically, mapping is a linear mind map. okay, if you've done that before. So instead of the map going everywhere all around a central idea, it's coming down in a linear fashion. It's best suited for very well structured lectures, and it's good for concepts with many categories which are directly or indirectly linked. So, mapping is actually really good for anatomy, but I would also recommend considering using mapping alongside another form like Cornell or the outline method. Just beware, like I said, it can be a little overwhelming to start off with. So I might recommend that if you want to try out mapping, try it with brainstorming and just general mind mapping first before moving into doing all of your notes in the mapping style. And finally, I want to mention the QEC method. Now, QEC stands for question, evidence, and conclusion, and it helps you connect ideas in class through questions and answers. This is best used in arts-based courses like philosophy, history, and literature, and it can also be used when you're drafting essays in any of those courses. This style really encourages clarity in writing and critical reflection of arguments, and it's also an excellent tool for revision. So, what you're doing is you're looking at the subject of that class, you're turning it into a question, and you're looking for evidence that's going to help you answer that question or the point of the class. And then that conclusion is a bit like the summary section of the Cornell note taking method. I've provided links below to all of these styles so you can get a bit more information. But I just want you to know that you don't have to use the same style in every single class that you take, and that you can mix and match any of these styles or any elements from these styles to create your own. What is the most important thing to remember, though, is to be consistent in how you take your notes, clear and concise. I want to conclude just by briefly talking about some things we can do with our notes after the lecture. I've kind of touched on this already, the importance of not being passive in our note taking. So, not copying things out word for word, and not just sort of leaving our notes to sit until our exam rolls around. So, what you want to do with your notes is take it just from that sort of passive, potentially just sitting in the binder, not being used, to an active learning exercise for yourself. Active learning is the process of critically thinking about what you have learned or what you're in the process of learning. And it's also the process of returning to what you've learned regularly. So if you take notes today, it's a good idea for you to return to them and review them in a couple of days' time. And this spaced study method actually helps you build long term memory, particularly when we start each study session with just a moment to sit and reflect and go, what do I remember from what I learned a few days before? Now, immediately after the lecture, though, I do want you to do a few things. I don't want you just to kind of walk out of the lecture and go, well, I'm going to review this in a couple of days. What I want you to do is walk out of that lecture and write a summary. If you're doing the Cornell note taking method, this is part of the process, anyways. If you're not, I still think it's a valuable exercise to undertake because it forces you to actively think about what you were learning in class. This is also an opportunity for you to fill in any gaps and to ask any questions that you might still have of your professor or your TA. Now, I understand you might have a really packed schedule, and doing any sort of review or rewording of notes, anything like that after class is out of the question. But I want you to try to do it the same day that you take the class. The other thing that I would like you to try to do, and this doesn't have to be the same day as your class, but maybe once a week, sit down with a friend and compare your notes. What did you take that was similar? What was different? Is there anything that your friend does that's better? Is there anything that you can suggest to your friend that they could do differently with their notes? This exchange of information is going to help you become a better note taker yourself as you start to see what other people consider important and why. Reflection is a really important part of active learning. And reflecting with someone else is going to help strengthen your own understanding of the course content and your own skill of note taking. Remember that the key to success is to get help early and often. And so if you have any questions about today's video and you would like personalized support from the learning strategist, please go online and book an appointment at UBCO's Student Learning Hub's Q Reserve site, or email us at learning.hub@ubc.ca.